Everyone, we want to invite you to our latest Deal Board podcast where we're talking about another piece of deal structure, earnouts.
Yeah, why are they good for the buyer? Why are they good for the seller? Do they get paid? How do you structure them? What are the reasons for an earnout? We have all kinds of things to go over.
Yeah, and as always, we have two great guests, an expert on both the deal structure side and the legal side of earnout. So tune in and get our latest Deal Board podcast episode from your podcasting app or at our website, thedealboardpodcast.com.
In today's economy, more people than ever are looking to buy and sell businesses. But how do you do it? Welcome to the Deal Board, presented by Transworld Business Advisors. Straight talk about real deals and real people. Listen to stories, interviews, and expert advice to help your business sale, merger, or acquisition process. Now, here are your business exit experts, Andy and Jessica.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Deal Board. And we have a great episode today. And it's very timely because this topic, we're seeing a lot of it out there. And it's all because that there's basically risk in the marketplace. The marketplace is hot, but there's risk in the marketplace. And what are we talking about today, Jessica?
We are talking about earnouts today. So we're doing Earnouts 101. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot in our industry, and we have a lot of buyers asking about it, a lot of sellers asking about it. So Andy and I are going to do a brief overview of what an earnout is, why you would even want to use one. And then we have two great experts on the show today. I interviewed Leanne from our Transworld M&A team. She sees lots of deals with earnouts, and she did a great breakdown of what an earnout is, why you would use one, why you want it, and really looking forward to that. And Andy, you have a great interview on the legal side.
Right. I have Deborah Carman from Carman Law, and we've talked to Deborah before. She is the number one attorney down here in South Florida closing deals, but specifically a lot of small deals. And it was interesting to talk to her to talk about some of the earnouts and some of the things that she's seeing even in small deals. And again, that's because we see that the marketplace is very fluid right now. The coronavirus goes, it comes, it's spiking, it's not spiking, there's mandates, there's not mandates. All those things can affect the business moving forward. And when people are buying and perhaps paying top dollar, and sellers think they should get that. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we'll get to the interviews in a little bit, but let's start with let's just lay the groundwork. What is an earnout? So you may have heard some of our shows before, our M&A shows, where we dive into the weeds a little bit. But if we just look at the earnout as a basic structure, it's a portion of the purchase price when a business is sold that gets delayed. And it's usually tied to performance. I like to think of it as like a simplistic, if you think about it very simply, it's almost like a commission payment, right? The seller is going to get paid some sort of commission or dollars from future performance of the business.
Yeah, it's a promise to pay if something happens, and it's a big if. And the question is what do you tie it to? Because you want to make sure that it's pretty definable, because you don't want any wiggle room on either side, and you don't want to have to do incredible things like audits or try to figure out exactly if they reach the benchmark to pay the earnout. Right.
So, and Leanne gets into a little bit of that today, but I mean, a very simple example is, say the earnout might be tied to revenue, and the seller gets $1 for every $100 of revenue in the future, and it's defined by a time period. That's what we're talking about today. And and like I said, we'll dive in. Leanne and Deborah will dive into some of the details on it. But the other big question is, Andy, we'll get into buyers a little bit for next, but why would a seller want to do an earnout?
Well, the seller would want to do an earnout so they could get all the cash that they thought they were going to get, right? So there's a basic difference in opinion of what the business is worth, and to try to bridge that gap, they want to have some sort of earnout so they could get maximum value.
All right. What you said right now, we kicked off the show of there's just a lot of uncertainty in the world today, right? So you could be sitting on a business that you think is worth more, but the buyer sees a lot of risk and uncertainty in the current environment. So we've seen a lot of this to solve that valuation gap, right? Between what a business is worth and then, protecting the risks from the buy side. There's also other benefits for seller, right? You can defer taxes, things like that. You're not getting paid all up front, but that's the big one that we're seeing right now is solving that valuation gap.
Yeah. I mean, because what would happen is that sellers, but listen, sellers always have an optimistic view of what's going on. And especially right now, businesses had a tough time in 2020. It's 2021. They're recovering and they might be, I've heard reports. I just had a Zoom meeting this morning with top medical experts saying this is all going to be over by December because everybody's getting sick and or vaccinated. So either way, this will kind of resolve itself by December. And if that truly happens and 2022 is going to be a great year, the sellers might be hesitant to sell now and say, what? I want 2022 numbers or I want 2021 numbers.
Right. Which also kind of ties us into, we've come up with 9 reasons why you would do an earnout. And most of this is like why a buyer would do an earnout, but there's also some reasons that tie into why a seller would want to consider it too. So the first one we've already talked about is that difference in opinion of value. There's a valuation gap where there's some big risk that the buyer doesn't want to assume and say like, hey, I'm definitely going to pay you for this. I will pay you, like you said, Andy, if this happens. What's our second reason why out of those 9?
Well, our second reason is what's happening out there in the world sometimes is when people are going to sell a business, we often tell them you have to continue to run your business like there's not a buyer. And so sometimes they're confronted with having to make capital investments. They have to make a capital investment in new equipment because it breaks down. They have to make major repairs that are going to last for 20 years and be amortized over that time or depreciated. And the sellers are hesitant to do it. And the buyers who are about to buy say, no, you got to do this. And the seller looks at it and says, well, how do I get paid for that?
Right. All right. It's a really good reason for an earnout. Our third reason is new customer or contract regulatory approval. So sometimes, when you're selling a business is still running, right? So if something could be happening in the business where you could be getting a large new customer, large new contract. We see this a lot with our construction clients, and we were dealing with a construction client in Denver who was waiting on a contract from the city of Denver that they've been working on for a year to do the airport project, which is a $1 billion project that's going on out in Colorado right now. And the seller's like, wait a second, I just spent 2 years trying to get this contract. Like, how am I going to get paid on it? Because he did a lot of the upfront work. So it's a good reason for an earnout from the sell side.
And from the buy side, what might happen is the buyer might use it as a reason for the buyer to be picked. Like we said, there's tons of competition for deals. So a buyer might come to the plate and say, hey, listen, if I buy this business, I'm going to be able to bring all these customers and give you a ton of business. And I'll tell you what I'll do. If you let me buy the business, I'll put an earnout provision that if I bring all these customers, you'll get the share in those future earnings.
Yeah, it's a nice big carrot.
Yeah, it's great. So the fourth reason is sort of tied into that the seller wants a piece of the future growth, or the buyer is willing to provide some of it.
Yep. And we hear this a lot too, right? Is that the sellers put in a lot of processes, procedures, sometimes technology, IP, and they haven't really felt the growth or the impact of it yet. So a lot of times we'll get the question from sellers is like, well, I put in all this legwork for the business. How do I get paid for the future potential or future growth? And that could be a way.
Yeah, it could be a way. What's another reason? What's the next reason?
So pending government legislation, and this is one where it could either be government legislation that's going to positively affect the business, but it could also protect from the risk side. So another great Colorado example is when cannabis first got approved for business, there was still a lot of uncertainty whether or not, when Colorado was the only state that could legally sell weed, whether or not that was going to be taken away from a federal standpoint. So it was a big risk for the buyer, right? That if you're looking at a cannabis company or a company that provided services to the cannabis industry, what if that government legislation changed? And how do you protect against the downside? So if there is some type of pending government legislation that's going to positively or negatively affect the business, an earnout can solve for that.
And we've seen it here in Florida with the infrastructure bill. So we have a paving company for sale, and guess what? They're hesitant on selling on a contract they already have in place, that if this infrastructure bill goes through, they're going to build a bunch of highways and they're going to get contracts. And so the buyer saying, listen, still sell it to me. I will sign something that if we get blah, blah, blah contracts or this much contracts, we will pay you more.
All right. It makes total sense. So what's number 6?
Well, a lot of times there is a customer concentration or supplier concentration issue in businesses, and we see this a lot. We had a deal, medical supply business, and the number one customer was a hospice company, famous hospice company, but a hospice company. 75% of the sales were with one company. So there was competition for the deal, but still the buyer said, hey, you got to protect us for 2 years on that contract. And that's what we did.
Yeah, it's another good way to solve for a downside risk. We actually had a similar deal, also a medical supply company. So number 7, we've already touched on a little bit, but it's deferred taxes. And this benefits the seller. So when you sell a business, you are going to pay taxes on the sale price, right? And we're actually working on a capital gains episode too, as a side note, but some of it's going to be capital gains tax. Some of it's going to be ordinary income. And at times it behooves a seller not to have all of your purchase price or, the money you receive from the business sale hit in the same tax year, because it's going to move your tax bracket up. And it also gives you some time to, come up with some more innovative ways throughout the deal process. So if you can defer taxes over the course of 1, 2, 3 years, that helps a lot.
Yeah. And so it does help a lot. And what can happen then, number 8, our 8th reason is that the buyer just doesn't have the money. Something happens. We've seen this before in the middle of a deal. All of a sudden a funding source pulls out or the buyers don't have the cash to close for some strange reason, or something happens in due diligence where all of a sudden some risk comes out. And so this is done just purely to reduce the buyer's inlay of cash.
Yeah. We see it a lot, especially if financing is not an option. And then our last reason, and we see this a lot, is it's not always about the money, right? Sometimes it's about keeping the seller engaged in the transition process. Especially if a seller is very hands-on in running the company or running customer-facing operations or employee operations, and the buyer wants them to stay involved for a period. Having some type of earnout that incentivizes them to make sure the transition goes well, make sure year 1 goes well, maybe make sure year 2 goes well. Sometimes that's just as important as what the purchase price is ultimately to the buyer, right? They want that seller engaged and they want a ideal transition as much as possible, at least.
Yeah, I've seen things as silly as they're buying the seller a cell phone, and they're going to give the seller a cell phone, and they want the seller to pick up the phone if that big client or that big supplier or a dealership has issues, whatever it is, dealership transfer has issues. They want to know that the seller is going to pick up that phone. And so to do that, they put in an earnout, give them a cell phone and say, listen, you need to be able to answer this basically almost 24/7.
Yeah. And Leanne talks about this too. Sometimes earnouts might not be tied to like a financial metric. It could be tied to something as creative as like, you have to answer that phone, right? Or you don't get paid.
You just, we try not to do that. I mean, we really want these earnouts to be clear. They want them to be very specific on how they're doing it. Like, we don't like revenues, because if we incentivize the buyer to have less revenues, that would be bad. So we try to tie it to gross profits. So make sure that if they just say lower their prices or something, they're not doing something to hide, revenues, and incentivize them to keep that gross profit, so that the seller says, hey, you're still earning the kind of money that you would earn. And then we also want to make sure we don't tie it to expenses, of course, to EBITDA, because so much could be pushed through in the expenses, and the seller has to then try to unwind it or do an audit. So we don't like that either.
Yeah, the simpler, the better. And that really is helpful in the earnout structure. So we've kind of introed this, and like we said, Deborah and Leanne are going to get into some of the more details, but also we wanted to talk about the trends in the marketplace. So typically in the past, we've seen earnouts on larger deals. We see earnouts with a lot of private equity buyers, but in today's environment, and we tease this a little bit, we're starting to see them on more deals and even some smaller size deals to solve for some of these risks, right, Andy?
Yeah, again, when things are getting very competitive on either side, either the buy or sell side, we're seeing more creative things done to try to get deals closed and try to get more value for sellers and buyers and avoid risk. Obviously, there's a huge portion of risk out there that people are looking at with the coronavirus, perhaps even taxation, perhaps even inflation, all those kind of fears out there that we're trying to, the buyers are trying to manage. At the same time, on the sell side, sellers have choices and they have lots of people out there. So these earnouts can be a great stick to get a deal done, a great tool to get a deal done.
Yeah. So here's another tool in your toolbox, right? Whether you're buying or selling, you're looking at deal structure. We've talked about cash. We've talked about bank financing in the past. We've talked about seller financing. Now you've got earnouts too.
It's a real win-win, right?
Yeah,
it's
a real win-win. And I said in our interview with Leanne too, we said, the greatest part about earnouts is you can be really creative with this and you can design a win-win situation because it's all about figuring out what's going to work for the buyer and the seller and ultimately be best for the company.
Yeah. And I talked to Deborah, and in my conversation with Deborah, we talked about how many times are they paid? Do they actually go through and pay these? And I brought out an example myself. I bought a, business brokerage and I used contingent notes as the vehicle. We'll talk about that. And I paid both of them. And I was happy to do it because, again, it was a win-win. We reached our revenue goals, our commission goals, and I paid out.
Yeah. So we hope you find this episode interesting. We're trying to keep it basic at that 101 level. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that can go into this, but let's get to this episode and our two great interviews.
Let's do it.
Transworld Business Advisors is the world's largest business brokerage and mergers and acquisitions firm with over 500 brokers in nearly 200 offices worldwide. Transworld's team handles thousands of business sales every year. To be connected with a qualified business broker or learn more about the buying and selling process, visit tworld.com/the deal board or call 888-719-9098.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deal Board. And we have a returning guest because she is the best. We have Deborah Carman of Carman Law, and we're talking about earnouts, and Deborah does so many deals, and she just got done with one, right, Deborah?
Yes, I did, Andy. And it was a very interesting deal because there was quite a large earnout involved there. And it really brings to light some of the issues that come about over here with the legalities and how to write the asset purchase agreements to make sure that both buyers and sellers have protected rights.
Right. Our subject today is earnouts, and we're talking, we've been talking about the ins and outs, what's usually in an earnout and why earnouts, but we definitely wanted to talk to Deborah because everybody's afraid of earnouts. Sellers are usually afraid of earnouts because they feel like that they'll never get their money, right? And buyers want earnouts. Let's talk about why buyer want earnouts, because I just was talking to you before this, and we were talking about a lot of people think it's because that there's a difference in value, that the sellers are trying to get more value than the buyer wants to put at the closing table and are willing to do a what if. But you and I both feel that it might be more of a risk avoidance kind of play.
No, I agree with you totally, Andy. And it is a risk avoidance type of play because you see sellers get very nervous because once they go through with the sale, they want to be done. And a buyer is in a different situation because the buyer says, this is a service industry I'm buying. And without that seller being there, what am I really getting into? It's not like I'm selling widgets. So when you get in that situation, you really have to be careful and you really want a committed seller. Best way to commit a seller, have an earnout.
Right. So having an earnout is something that you could do to avoid risk in a deal and or lock in the seller, like what just happened in your deal, correct?
Correct. And when you lock in the seller, you can do it in a couple different ways. And again, you can do it by 12 months that you can look back. You can do it by 24 months, 36 months. Traditionally, I don't see much more than that because the seller certainly is not going to look to become more involved at that point in time. And what is the seller's biggest worry? The seller's biggest worry is you're going to run the business differently than I am. And what am I going to do here? I'm going to be left with a business that you are taking out employees, you're doing things to cut costs, and I'm supposed to show you I can earn the same amount of money, or you're putting more costs in. What am I supposed to do? So that makes it difficult for the attorney because we really have to make sure the language is exactly there as it's supposed to be, because if I leave one word out, it's up to a court.
Right. And that's always not the most efficient way of settling disputes or settling. So you try to write these things up with certain protections for the sellers
Yes.
and certain very clear ways to calculate the earnout. So what have you seen recently?
What I've seen recently is based on gross profit. Of course, it can be based on EBITDA. It can be based on a lot of different other types of metrics, but that's most recently what I've been seeing.
Right. So gross profit, we like gross profits because it's probably the thing that you could play with the least. Obviously, if you're just if the buyer didn't want to make the earnout, they would just raise the prices or do things that would bring down sales. So gross profit would lock them in. And so we do like gross profit. Do you think, we've seen a few more earnouts because of COVID crisis, because people are unsure of the future? Is that what you're seeing as well?
I really do see quite a few more earnouts now because of COVID. And I think, unfortunately, I'm going to continue to see them because of the second outbreak we just had. I was hoping for more stability, but I think, unfortunately, we're going to see another whole round over here of people who are unsure of what the future is going to be. And really, that's what an earnout is. The earnout is what is our future.
Right. And so let's talk about some of the things. How do you set up an earnout legally? I mean, what do you do? It's in the purchase agreement, perhaps, that they contemplate an earnout based on gross sales, and they talk about how much the seller gets and how much the buyer would have to pay if a certain metric is hit. But how do you set that up?
We set it up, just as you mentioned over there in the asset purchase agreement. We set it up with certain thresholds being met, with an audit being held, and with certain time periods being listed. Specifically, if I can, which a lot of attorneys don't like, I will do an example. But a lot of the buyer's attorneys don't like the examples, and they will cut them out. What they will do is they'll just list specifics over there on the APA. And that really, to me, to do the example, at least is a better way that the seller can see what they're going to receive.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I like that. I want clarity in these documents for the sellers, for the buyers. Everybody understand what's going. So I think an example is a great way to do that. Is there a separate document just for the earnout, or how do you set that up?
I've seen separate documents for earnouts. Now, when you go into the larger M&A deals, of course, no one wants a separate document. Everything has to be contained within the APA, or it's just not going to happen. So in smaller deals, you do earnouts separately, and I've even papered them with promissory notes.
So like a promissory note, and I did this when I've bought some business brokerages. I bought a business brokerage once upon a time, and I had 2 promissory notes. And funny you say you don't see things for much more than 2 years. So this was a 2-year promissory note. If they hit a certain amount of commissions in the first year, I would give them this promissory note. Otherwise, it went away. If we hit another threshold of commissions in the second year, the promissory note would come into play and or go away if it was too low. Now, the good news for the seller, and maybe the bad news for me as the buyer was, and I think it was good news for me too, we hit both thresholds, and the buyer got paid. I mean, the seller got paid. Right.
It's a win-win, Andy. You can't beat that at all. And that's what people do. When they have the promissory notes, they adjust them. And they're basically just adjustable promissory notes. It's the easiest way I know, at least in a smaller deal, to do this.
Right.
And we just adjust what it's going to be. Start out with something now, because normally in a business, particularly if a lot of the earnout is going to be there and it's not going to be where there's a lot of down payment, then you have to be very careful what you do with a promissory note, because at least the seller is going to receive something.
Right.
Somewhere in that threshold, they're going to receive X, and you have to just make that determination in the note, and it's easier to do it that way. When you do it a large M&A, you're not looking at they're not going to look for all their money to be tied up in an earnout. It's just going to be, quote unquote, I guess, in a way, a bonus.
Right. A bonus, again, just assuring, and like you said, they want to see the seller stick around, right? For the most part, they're looking for that transfer of goodwill.
Right, exactly. That's what they're looking for. And of course, we have interesting sellers because some of our sellers back away from this concept, just like they back away when they sell the business and do a non-compete and say, well, gee, now I'm out of a livelihood. So you get those type of sellers, at all ends, and you just have to watch what you do over there to protect their interests, but also make it fair. And
Right.
that's what really this is all about.
Yeah, and in protecting their interest, what do you see? Usually the buyers have to pay on an annual basis. It's usually done at the end of a year, quarterly. What's kind of what you've seen?
In a smaller business, if you're going to take it as a note, of course, it's a different situation. If you take it in an M&A, it's usually a 1 year look back.
1 year look.
And at that point, you're going to do the adjustment. You're going to do an audit. If you need an audit, but at that point, you'll be able to see, the seller will be able to see what happened with the accounting. They'll be able to see how things are done. And the unfortunate part is, if you don't do it correctly, these are litigation magnets.
Right, which we don't want. And what control does the seller have over the organization post-closing usually?
The seller doesn't have a lot of control.
That's why I was asking. I wanted to clarify that. For all those sellers who think they're going to be able to control it, they probably are not.
Good luck. Okay, that's why we're very careful to write the parameters, because if you put down there, you can't hire 16 more employees, or you can't do these other territories, or you can't start putting in other places that you're doing business. At that point, at least you can control some of it, but you really can't control how they're going to run the business. Now, if you do a consulting agreement and attach that, then you're in a better situation because they're there for that year.
Right. And we've seen that. We've seen that consulting agreements are oftentimes tied at the same time length of a earnout, because the sellers do want to be able to, especially when there's a customer concentration issue, say, where there's a concentration on supply issue, where the buyer feels if that one customer goes away or that one supplier goes away, they're no longer going to have a business.
Right.
So the seller is going to want to make sure that they can stick around to make sure that customer is treated fairly, or that vendor is paid on time, or
exactly. And when you think about it, Andy, it's not much different than when you do a regular seller note. When the seller stays there at the business, you always see a little bit higher performance. When the seller leaves the business, the performance may not be as high, depending upon what kind of business they're buying.
Right. And what about the success of these seller earnouts? Do you see a lot of them go bad? Do you see, for the most part, what do you see?
For the most part, I do not see them go badly. Okay. I see them go badly when the business had problems to begin with. Right. And that's why the buyer did it this way. And the buyer knew, and the seller did not continue to perform, didn't do anything. And at that point, everything falls apart. But if you have a committed seller and that buyer's done his homework, there'll be a win-win.
Yeah, the 2 or 3 deals that I've personally been involved with where there were some earnouts, they've all been paid. I mean, so it did exactly what they're designed to do, was make the buyer feel better about buying the business, and the seller giving assurances that the businesses were going to continue. Right.
And what's kind of nice too is you think about, for a buyer's perspective, they don't have to put as much cash down on the table.
Right.
So in essence, they're taking that money, they're building the business with it. They know they have to pay it within a year, but they have that ability. They're not taking a note payment and making, monthly payments on it.
Right. So any other legalities that you see in these documents? Is sometimes they write up things that the buyer has to do certain things?
Yes.
To perform?
Well, let's take a simple one. Let's take pool routes. Okay. So you know what the buyer has to do to perform over there. You know, they have to be on there. They have to have the same level of service. They have to do the same concentration. Everything has to be replaced over there. If they have a problem with a customer, they have to replace that customer. There's all kinds of parameters you can put in place, and something simple like that. It becomes a little bit more difficult as the business grows bigger.
Yeah.
And
So again, in that case, the seller, I've seen that happen. Great example, because I've seen that where sellers selling a whole bunch of pool customers to another pool company, and staying in business, like they're a contractor and they had pool routes. We saw that, and I think one of the deals that we're talking about, and the contractor was selling off their pool routes. Well, the nice thing about it is the contractor is going to still be building pools. So the seller had the buyer wanted an earnout provision that if they lost the pool customers, that the seller had to replace them. And the seller was like, okay, give me that ability. I'll replace any pools that you lose.
And that's actually a win-win for everybody. And that works out, really nicely there. It's just another example of how you can do this, not just in a situation where the business performs, but also if you lose accounts.
Right. And I've seen that with customer concentration issues, that the seller has the ability to come in or is notified of a potential problem, and they have the ability to come in to try to save the customer and or the vendor. So
and that gets a little dicey legally, because did they put enough effort in? Is there basically a fiduciary duty over here, implied good faith? Okay, so there is implied good faith, but are they really going and doing it? Are they not doing it? This is what causes some of the disputes when we talk about accounts being lost.
Right.
They're putting that attention really towards there. You're going to go to that customer and you're going to get an affidavit. Now everybody's up in arms, and what's really going to go on with that business? Now you're involving your customers. So that's where it becomes a little bit more dicey. And I'd say if really the buyer and seller work together, none of this would occur.
Right. And obviously we create legal documents for kind of the rules of engagement. It certainly doesn't tell people that every little thing that happens, they're going to have to continue to cooperate. It's kind of just like guidelines that everybody needs to. And we certainly don't want to see things devolve to a legal argument. We have gotten involved post-closing to help people negotiate certain things, and we're always here for people as well. And I know you are as well. We always try to jump in and say, get everybody, calm down here, but that doesn't happen too often. And these earnouts are a very effective tool of trying to mitigate risk. And listen, isn't the world a bunch of risk right now?
The world is a bunch of risk, and I think there was a Mark Twain one that said over here, he quoted that it's difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future.
Right. So,
and I think in this kind of world, and I know that I've been doing this 38 years, I've never seen a world like this. We've been through the recession, we've been through everything over here, but we've never seen anything turn on, the physical problems, what's going on with the virus and how it's affected really every industry, everything here, period. I don't think we've ever come across anything like this. At least I know I haven't.
And for good and bad, right? So we've seen some businesses soar because of the pandemic and their ability to sell more products or be able to do more cleaning, say like the janitorial business. And we've seen fortunes reverse in the hotel business and in the restaurant business, where their biggest problem is getting help to handle all the customers or supplies to be able to, feed all the people because they can't get certain products anymore right now. So we've seen all the supply chain issues. So all those things, earnouts can be very helpful. I'll give you a few minutes to give any parting advice to people who are considering an earnout.
Thank you, Eddie. The parting advice I would give is to make sure that everything is written as clearly as possible, because that's where disputes happen. As soon as you can find a loophole, and that's what attorneys are paid to do, they're paid to find loopholes in an agreement, then at that time, all bets are off and it's just going to become litigation city. So you really try to keep away from that. You try to make it as explicit as possible, and you try to keep that spirit of cooperation going. I know that we all think the same way. When I have an unhappy client, and an unhappy buyer and unhappy seller, what I do is I just blame everything on the attorneys and let them try to work everything out. So when they close, everything is smooth. Because if you don't have something at that point when you close between a buyer and a seller, it's just going to progressively get worse. And that's really what happens over here. We got to keep that honeymoon stage going for a long time with them.
Right. Well, that's great advice.
And I know that's what you do.
Yeah, no, that's why we're there as brokers, to try to mitigate any misunderstandings and try to get deals to the closing table. And that is at Deborah's office. If you want more information and talk more to Deborah about the legalities after 38 years of doing deals, she's got a few tips for you. Deborah, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Thank you, Andy. The best way is to give me a call at 561-392-7031. We look forward to speaking with you and seeing if we can assist you. And thank you again for having me on.
Thanks, Deb.
Always a
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Hey, Andy, do you know what time it is? It's time for our deal of the week.
Deal of the week. Sold.
Hey everybody, welcome back. It is Deal of the Week, and we have Rupesh Bharad, a returning guest from Transworld Business Advisors of Richmond. Rupesh, welcome back. You just did a nice deal. Tell us a little bit about it.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Jessica. I think this is 2021 picked up really, really well. We are seeing so many buyers out there. They are making really good deals, especially deal I want to talk about a roofing company in Northern Virginia. We have listed and we were able to sell at full price. It was about $2.5 million deal and another $1 million for the real estate. And right now, funding has been very easy, closing very smooth.
That's great. That's great. So tell us a little bit about the buyer. Like, who is looking for this type of deal?
So right now there are so many strategic buyers out there. There are so many new buyers out there, especially we encourage them using the SBA program and as well as the new buyer incentives, closing, providing them 3 months of interest and payment as well as waiving the SBA fees. So strategic as well as the new buyers, we have seen both.
Sounds like a great deal. What was the multiple on it?
It was like, a little close to like 3 multiple. And we originally expected around 2.75, but because of Transworld, we were able to compete a couple of buyers and get the best deal for the seller.
Another good deal for good people. Great point too, Rupesh. Always creating competition amongst buyers is going to raise that purchase price, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and construction's hot. I mean,
Yes.
I think it's the second biggest industry we're selling right now. So
Absolutely.
So Rupesh, if someone wants to get in touch with you about this deal or maybe other potential deals in Virginia, how can they reach you?
So they can reach at us directly, rupesh@tworld.com. They can directly call us at 804-399-0870 or our website tworld.com/RVA.
thanks for being with us, Rupesh. Always happy to have you on.
Thank you so much.
Hi, welcome back, everybody. And this week on the deal board, like you heard in our intro, we're focusing on earnouts and what exactly is an earnout. So joining us today is one of our experts from our team. Leanne is the vice president of our Transworld M&A division, headquartered out of Florida. Leanne, welcome so much to the show, and thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be with you guys today.
Yeah. So we're talking to our audience. We're doing Earnouts 101. So let's just start by, let's define what is an earnout.
So an earnout is a contractual provision between the buyer and the seller where at least some portion of the purchase price is going to come after close based on deliverables met, either earnings revenue, sometimes it's an operational milestone, but the idea is that not all of the purchase price is coming at close. Some piece of it is coming after the close based on mutually agreed to, timeframes and deliverables.
Okay. So it's kind of like a version of seller financing, right? As a buyer, I don't have to come up with the cash all at once, right?
Exactly. I would say that probably the difference between the earnout and the seller financing is that the risk is being shifted to the seller. right? So, the typical scenario here, so why do buyers and sellers use an earnout, right? So
Right.
high level, the issue is that there is not agreement on price, right? So, the seller wants a certain amount, the buyer wants a certain amount, and they're trying to get to some agreement. And an earnout is a tool that you can use to bridge that valuation gap and get a deal across the finish line. And, there's potential benefits when it's done correctly to the buyer and the seller. So that's why someone uses an earnout. And, the main issue, or, like I said, the difference between, the seller financing and the earnout is the seller financing, the risk is still on the buyer for the most part, because it's a predefined value and, payout metric that isn't going to change. On the earnout side, the risk is being shifted to the seller in exchange for the seller getting the purchase price that they want, the total purchase price that they want. They are willing to assume some of the risk that is going to come over the next couple years. So they're assuming the operational risk in return for getting the purchase price that they want.
I love how you phrase that, right? Because, well, one, you talked about a couple things there. One is it can solve a valuation gap, right? The seller, at me as a seller, I think my business is worth $5 million, right? The buyer's like, it's worth 3 million. So we can come to an agreement with that gap, sometimes with an earnout, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. But I also, you picked up something very important too, is it does shift some risk to the seller. So it's kind of like, prove it to me. So you think the business is worth 5 million. How did you come up with that? Prove that to me a little bit as the buyer.
Right, exactly. And we've been there before. And the thing with an earnout is it's such a good tool for, a business broker or an M&A advisor to be able to bring to the transaction, right? Because, when you have that gap between buyer and seller, a lot of times your first inclination is to, well, let's just meet in the middle. And sometimes, you're outside of that zone and there isn't a meeting in the middle. And so to have another, tool in your toolbox that you can use to bridge that gap and, make a transaction happen. This is a very valuable tool. And, they're, clearly from the buyer side, right? So how does this benefit? How does it benefit the buyer and the seller, right? So why do people do it, right? So clearly from the seller side, you have a price in mind. You have an idea of what your future cash flows are going to be, and you want to get all of that value. But of course, there is some uncertainty with those future cash flows, right? I mean, just operationally, but look at what's happened in the last couple of years with Corona, right? I mean, there's uncertainty with your future cash flows. So buyers are assessing the future cash flows. And when that doesn't meet, especially if you're a broker representing the seller, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get every bit of value for them, right? You don't want to leave any chips on the table. So when you're able to structure an earnout that works for everyone, clearly from the seller's perspective, they're going to be able to get value for their future cash flows that, are relatively uncertain. And like I said before, they're assuming some of the risk for it.
Right.
From the buyer's perspective, there's many benefits, right? It's a clear win for them.
Right.
Yes, they are agreeing to pay, some future value for the cash flows, but they essentially are able to transfer the risk of those future cash flows to the seller. So that's obviously a clear benefit to them. But so there's benefits. So you have the potential, if you structure it right, for it to be win-win. Right. So and that's why you do it. The downside is that now you have created a situation that has the potential to, the main problem with crafting these things. And the reason why so often, sellers really don't want to do it, and even buyers really don't want to do it, is because now the key to it being successful is aligning incentives, right? So you've got to make sure that the way you are structuring this is aligning the incentives of the buyer to the incentives of the seller. And that's where the devil is in the details, and why so often you might have a conversation and you might start going down the path of structuring an earnout. But when it's all said and done, when you really get into it, very often sellers are like, probably let's try to meet in the middle, because it can be really tough to structure it in a way that that really works for everyone. And let me ask.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, because it was funny, you were just talking about that, and the question I get from sellers a lot, the most popular one is like, okay, so this sounds great, I can get a bigger valuation, the buyers are on board with it, right? But the question the sellers always come back with, well, what happens if it doesn't happen and I don't get paid, right? The biggest fear, right? And is that the biggest risk for the seller side?
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, so the seller really is assuming the risk here. I mean, from the buyer's perspective, once they've gone down the path of getting an earnout, the buyer's risk is relatively minimal. I mean, one, they need to make sure that if they're structuring it in a way that, they haven't misaligned incentives to have the seller out, performing in a way that isn't, producing for the bottom line. But provided, and we can talk about, how do you make those structures so it aligns the buyer and the seller. And the other risk on the buyer side is just the noise and the distraction to management that comes along with some of these earnouts, right? Because it can get a little bit, litigious, when you're talking about, did we meet the goals, so there can be a little bit of distraction there. But, from the buyer's perspective, as long as they're aligning the incentives and trying to, minimize the distraction to management, once they get this earnout in place, they're in a good position. The risk falls to the seller, right? So, I mean, the biggest risk, obviously, is in the majority of these situations, the seller has sold a majority stake in the company. So they're no longer the decision maker, right? So if you set up a situation where you're supposed to get paid, some amount at 12 months if certain revenue targets are hit, let's say, and let's say another target at 24 months if certain revenue targets are hit. The problem is that you're not in complete control of whether you hit those revenue targets, right? And to be honest, you're not even in control of whether the company remains solvent. The buyer is making, so let's talk, I mean, that's the highest risk. The highest risk is the buyer makes some poor decisions and the company isn't even solvent. So now you are just in line with a whole bunch of other creditors, right? So how do you mitigate that? The number one thing, most important, if any seller or buyer is even considering an earnout, it's so important that you have a qualified, experienced M&A attorney, experience with these earnouts, because things will go south if you don't have these structured and the incentives aligned contractually by lawyers who really know what they're doing. So
I totally agree. We've talked a lot about on the show, look, we're business brokers and M&A advisors, and we think that brokers and advisors should be involved in every deal, but a critical piece, especially with earnouts, is attorneys, right? Because if you don't paper this correctly, if you're not in agreement, it's just, there's a big open can of worms as a seller that you're not getting anything out of that deal, right?
Exactly. So let's look at the highest level of risk, right? The buyer comes out and just runs your business into the ground, right? So make sure you have a buyback provision in there, right? Make sure that you're not just in line with 15 other creditors, that you have some, ability to, try to buy it back, right? Okay, so then the next level of risk is, you have created an earnout structure where, you as the seller have certain goals that you're supposed to meet, but you're not in complete control of that. So you want to have as much control as possible over the performance measures that you are going to be measured against, right? So what are those typically? Typically what you're going to see on the financial side. So what kind of financial measures? Typically you're seeing revenue measures, and you're seeing EBITDA measures, right? And there's pros and cons to both of those, right? So obviously from a seller's perspective, right? If you no longer have control over the operating expenses of your business, you really don't want to go with a measure that is EBITDA, because you have no control over those expenses, and the chance of you being able to meet those goals is going to be very, very tough. So from a seller's perspective, you want to have ideally revenue measures, right? Because you have a little bit more control of that. But again, you still, there still needs to be some guarantees in place that the buyer is doing at least a minimum amount to assist you in those revenue projections, right? So things that you might want to put into the contractual arrangement are, guarantees on marketing spend, right? So like if they just come and cut the marketing budget, how are you going to meet your revenue goals?
Or like fire the sales team, right?
Exactly. There, if there's a key person who leaves, the buyer might not want to replace that big salary. But if there's 6 months of a key person not being there, that's going to make it really difficult. So the way you mitigate that risk as a seller, let's say you are able to get a revenue-based, performance metric, just think through what are the things that need to be in place on the operating side that you no longer are going to have control of once the, post-transaction, and just make sure that those are in the agreement so that, those things are in place and they give you every possibility of meeting, the goals that you're trying to achieve.
There's so much good stuff in there, Leanne, because we talk to a lot of clients and I always say hey, as a seller, the further up the P&L, the earnout's tied to, the more control you have, right? But I love how you also said, hey, let's take a look at the operations side. You've been running this business, right? Sometimes for 5, 10, 40 years, right? Yeah. You know what needs to happen to generate that revenue. So putting in those contracts hey, you have to spend X percentage or X dollars on marketing. You have to have a sales team, right? Because a buyer really could come in and change the operations to affect the revenue as well. We think a lot about EBITDA because you lose control of operating expenses usually when you sell. But you could also, an unsavory buyer or maybe just an uninformed buyer can make some key operational decisions that drive the revenue down as well.
Right, exactly. So, a lot of people talk about, revenue or EBITDA. And I like that you mentioned that there are other options in there. You just move it up the income statement a little bit, right? So gross profit is a nice medium, right? So there's less operating expenses that come into play. It's a lot easier to define in the working agreement, what expenses are going to go into the cost of goods sold or the cost of service. And so that's something easier to manage. So if you can't get it to be revenue based, if you can get it to be cost of goods sold, and the gross margin, that's going to be preferable to EBITDA, which, really makes it tough to.
Yeah. So, you mentioned earlier, we were talking about obviously things have changed a lot in the last, what are we saying, probably month 18 right now in the pandemic, right? And there's been a lot of movement in businesses. Some revenues have dropped, some profits have dropped. Have you seen more earnouts in the last 18 months to solve these valuation gaps, or has it stayed pretty steady?
Yeah, no, I feel that, earnouts now are becoming pretty standard. I think the metric as of, a couple of years ago was something like 30% of private M&A transactions, implemented an earnout provision. I would say now that that number is closer to 50 to 75%. And, I mean, for several reasons. One, it's a seller's market. And, these guys want, and these ladies, these business owners want to get every bit of value for the lifetime of effort that they've put into this business. And for something like COVID to come and just, wipe out, what they have worked so hard for, the earnout is the perfect solution to that problem. It's not a meet in the middle. Some of these businesses have taken such a hit on the revenue side that, the fair thing to do and what we need to be doing to help our sellers get the fairest value is to say, look, let's tack back to what things look like prior to COVID. And let's make the argument for why when we get out of this, we're going to be right back on track. And let's try to get you that value. And, it's important for us as advisors to help them understand, look, you're probably not going to get this value at close, right? Because there's just too much risk. There's too much uncertainty regarding free cash flows over the next couple of years. So it's unlikely that you're going to get that value at close, but we can make the argument and we can help structure something so that you are able to get that value. And the structure of that is an earnout.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to wrap us up. I think this conversation has been fantastic. I hope, sellers that are sitting out there, or even some buyers and some brokers understand earnouts more, but I couldn't agree with you more, Leanne. I think there's pros and cons to earnouts, but right now where we're sitting in the marketplace, there's a lot more pros and there's a lot of creativity. I think the one thing I want to leave our listeners with is that, yes, we laid out some of the basics of an earnout. We threw out some basic structures, but I think the best and hardest part about an earnout is you can structure it any really way that works for the buyer and the seller. So the creativity is key. Having great advisors, your broker, your advisor, and a great business attorney, like we mentioned too, are very key in making these work. Leanne, thank you so much for coming on the show. Hey, if anyone has a follow-up question or wants to get in touch with you, how can they reach you best?
Right. You can reach me on my email. It's Lerwin, Lerwin, at transworldma.com. And I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. And we'll drop that into the show notes as well. Leanne, thank you so much for joining us on the Deal Board today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Jessica, you know what time it is?
Money time?
Almost. It's time for listing of the week.
All right, welcome back, everybody. For our deal of the week this week, we have Patrick Bombardier from our Transworld, Colorado office. And Patrick, thanks for joining the show again. You've got a really interesting listing to share with us today.
That's right. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for having me. We do have a really great listing here in Colorado. It's a regional industrial and commercial tire and service business, one of the largest in the region. It's a business that specializes in heavy-duty equipment. This is farm, mining, construction equipment of all types. They do a lot of on-site work, mobile work for these huge vehicles, and they're very high-volume business. They've been in business 21 years. The business is for sale, and the real estate is also for sale if a buyer desires, though it could also be worked out for a lease as well. There's 18 employees that have been there, trusted long-term employees that are expected to stay. And the owner is a husband and wife that are looking to retire and move on to their next chapter. So this is an exciting one that I think a lot of people are going to be interested in.
Wow. Sounds like a great business, great longevity. Real estate's always nice too, as an additional investment if somebody wants that. So tell us a little bit about the numbers, Patrick. What's it listed for sale? What does its earnings look like?
Mm-hmm. So their all-time highest sales came in 2019 at about 7.3 million. In 2020, some of the industries that they work with had some slowdowns and shutdowns, and so they saw their sales go down to about 6.2, but their profitability stayed really very impressive. And in 2021, things are really moving back towards their high levels from 2019. The EBITDA on this business on an average between 2018, 2019, and 2020 is about $550,000. There's some inventory that's involved there as well. Actually, there's some high-end inventory that is the business has will be in addition to the sale price, and then also, of course, the real estate. The sale price on the business is $3.7 million, and the asking price on the real estate is $2.2 million at this point. Obviously, we'd be welcome to listen to anybody who would like to take a look at those numbers and talk about that valuation.
Wow. Actually, very good valuation, very consistent. We know, revenue is vanity, profit's sanity. So as long as their profit numbers stay consistent through the pandemic, who cares about the revenue, right? But strong EBITDA of $550,000. That's a nice sizable deal, good cash flow for a buyer. If someone's listening to the show right now, wants to learn more about this business, how do they get in touch with you?
Best way to reach me, there's a couple ways. You certainly could reach out with a phone call. My number is 303-929-9219, 303-929-9219, or email me at patrick@tworld.com. patrick@tworld.com.
And we'll drop those into the show notes too. And that'll be on our website, thedealboardpodcast.com. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us for this listing. And we hope to find you some buyers, and we hope to have you back again soon.
Great. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks for tuning into the show today. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends on social media. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcasting app. If you have questions, would like to appear, or have suggestions for topics for the show, get in contact with us through our website, thedealboardpodcast.com.